Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're going to be talking all about small space gardening and how I use a few really easy and simple gardening techniques to maximize the amount of food I'm able to grow in my small garden. Now, I do realize that depending on your current situation, my garden may not seem small to all of you. It does tend to feel very limiting to me though when I'm trying to grow a large amount of my family's produce. So, while I understand that there are many people out there who are even significantly more limited in space than I am, so I think that a lot of these techniques will work really well, even if you're gardening on a tiny little plot of land, or even if you have bigger space, or if, like me, you're somewhere in the middle. If I could use only one space-saving technique in my garden, I think that vertical gardening would be the one I would choose. Vertical gardening is a game changer when it comes to gardening for so many reasons. In this video, we're talking about space saving, so we're going to focus on that. I think at some point, probably in the next couple weeks, next couple months or so, I'm going to do a video completely dedicated to vertical gardening and all the benefits of it. But for today, we're going to focus on space saving. So you can see I have these arched trellises in my garden. These are really useful for growing lots of things. I personally use them to grow beans and cucumbers. So there are certain plants that really need to be grown vertically in order to have good results, such as pole beans. There are other plants that you can choose to grow vertically, whether or not they really need to be grown vertically, just because it saves a lot of space. So you can see that each of these trellises here only takes up a really small amount of bed space, and then the majority of the growing space that's used is actually walkway space. So that walkway space is something that's necessary for the garden. I mean, I obviously need to be able to access all of my plants growing, but we don't need to let it be unusable space for growing. So by arching these trellises over the walkways, I'm making use of every little bit of space possible. Additionally, you can see that I have this welded wire fencing. I have 3 panels of this in various parts of my garden. Over here across the walkway, you can see I have another one. I use these to grow my tomatoes. Now, there are a lot of reasons to trellis your tomatoes and grow them vertically besides just space saving, but the space saving is really significant. You know, tomatoes in nature, for the most part, are vining plants that crawl along the ground. If you grow a tomato unsupported, it will have a massive footprint and take up a massive amount of your garden. By trellising them like this, you're able to plant them much more closely together. Additionally, by growing my tomatoes on this trellis, I'm freeing up a lot of this ground space. In here, you can see I don't have anything growing yet, but I will be planting more plants. And then in the back, you can see my lettuce is off to a really good start. This is all space that's freed up by trellising my tomatoes and growing them vertically. So here's another example of vertical growing. Growing my peas on this fence uses a structure that has to be here anyway, taking up space, and puts it to work actually growing food for me. So I usually line my entire fence with peas. So not only will growing as many crops as possible vertically save you a lot of space, but it makes harvesting easier, it leads to healthier crops, and it just looks beautiful. So really, honestly, if I could only choose one, as I said, vertical gardening is my go-to space-saving technique. Another gardening technique that I like to do, which saves me a lot of space, is called interplanting. So this is my broccoli bed. You can see I have my broccoli seedlings in here. These ultimately will be huge plants, but right now you can see they're really small. Now in between the broccoli seedlings, you can see that I've planted lettuce. I've sown this lettuce really thickly, and this is going to really maximize the amount of produce I can get out of this one space. So when done correctly, interplanting can really maximize the amount of harvest that you get out of a small space in your garden. Now, as I mentioned, these broccoli plants will eventually be huge, but they're not right now. So if I can plant something in between the broccoli plants, right now there's lots of space between them. If I can plant something that has a much shorter maturity date than the broccoli, something that I'm going to be able to harvest by the time the broccoli is huge and needs this space, then that is a great option for space saving. Now you can see that I've chosen lettuce. There are lots of other reasons why I've chosen lettuce specifically for this purpose. But one reason is that it's small. It doesn't take up a lot of space. So even when the broccoli and the lettuce are both full size, they would be able to grow together really well because they have different growth habits, they have different root systems. They're a type of plant that can do really well together. Now, they are going to benefit each other in more ways than just space saving. I've talked about that at length in multiple videos, and I'm sure I will continue to talk about it more. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on the space-saving aspect. Now, lettuce is a great option because it is quick growing. It has a fairly quick maturity date. If you're growing it somewhere where you're going to ultimately need that space, you can harvest it really quickly, and then you'll have that space free. Other options for this would be radishes. Radishes are really quick growing as well, and you can harvest them and then free up that space. Bush beans are another great option that I like to stick in between a lot of my larger crops while they're smaller and just maximize the space possible. So as the season goes on, I'll be sure to show you how the broccoli and lettuce develop with each other and how they benefit each other growing in this space, and also how they benefit me as the gardener just by giving me a bonus harvest. Let's talk about succession sowing. Succession sowing is a really important technique when you're gardening in a small space. Honestly, I think it's really important anyway, but it becomes even more important when you're gardening, when your space is limited. So let's take a look at what will be my first lettuce harvest. As you can see, this lettuce is off to a great start. I started it nice and early in the season, and it's growing really well so far. So as we talked about before, lettuce does have a really short maturity date. That means that from the time you first put your lettuce seeds in the ground to harvest is very short compared to many other crops. You know, there's some crops that have to grow all season long. They may take months and months to be ready. Lettuce is not like that. Especially when you're harvesting for baby greens, it can be ready to harvest in maybe a month or two. It's a really quick growing plant. Now, the key to succession sowing is to continually fill in areas of your garden. You know, as I harvest that lettuce, space is going to free up here. And what I want to do is once I harvest that lettuce, once it's gone, I want to use that space to grow something else. I want to make sure that I don't have areas in my garden that aren't producing for me. Now, right now, you can see I do have some areas in my garden. That's because my last frost date hasn't come, and these areas are places where I am going to be growing frost tender plants like tomatoes. But once the season gets going, I'm going to, as much as possible, I'm going to make sure that every space in my garden is being put to some sort of purpose for me so that I can maximize the amount of production that I get in my small garden. Now, across the walkway here, you can see I have a second sowing of lettuce. This lettuce is quite a bit smaller than the lettuce that we just looked at. This was sown a couple weeks after that other lettuce. This is my second succession sowing of lettuce. And once that other lettuce is harvested and gone, and I fill in that space with something else, I'll be able to still get lettuce from this space here. And once this lettuce is gone, and I have filled in this space with something else, I'll be able to harvest the lettuce that I showed you earlier under my broccoli. So the idea is that by succession sowing, I keep my harvest going, and I also make sure that each space is producing to its maximum potential. Once the lettuce is harvested on both of these beds here, you know, I can replace it with many different things. I might replace it with some bush beans, maybe some quick growing summer squash like zucchini or something like that. The idea is that you want to be constantly rotating crops in. And don't be afraid to plant crops a little bit later in the season too, because, for example, I'm going to plant some zucchini seeds out in my garden as soon as my last frost date has passed. But at that point, I probably will still have lots of lettuce in that garden bed over there. So what I'll do is I'll wait and I'll harvest that lettuce. And then once that's gone, I could, for example, plant more zucchini seeds over there. And then that zucchini would take up producing when my first zucchini is done. You know, just kind of think about, even though that second zucchini sowing, that theoretical zucchini sowing, would be planted significantly after my last frost date, that doesn't mean that there isn't time in the season. You always want to be paying attention to how much time you have left in the season and what you can grow in that time. So next I want to talk about intensive planting, which honestly kind of piggybacks on the last 2 points that we were talking about. Especially, don't mind the noise in the background. My neighbor's guinea hens are out wandering and they are noisy little birds. So sometimes they come visit and eat the ticks in my yard, which I am thankful for, so they are welcome here anytime that they want to come. But they are very noisy. So if you can hear them in the background, that's what that noise is. So back to gardening. So when we talked about interplanting, and you saw the broccoli and the lettuce, you also saw my lettuce that I've sown very thickly for baby greens. That's called intensive planting. I am planting those plants more intensely, more closely than is often recommended. Now, you can go too far with this. You need to make sure that your plants still have space to grow to a full size, that they still have space for good airflow to minimize disease. But you don't necessarily always need to plant your plants as widely spaced as the seed packets will tell you. Often those seed packets are assuming that you have a row garden where you just put, a single row of, say, tomatoes or lettuce or zucchini or whatever. You put a single row, then you have a walkway, then another single row, then a walkway. In that case, you do need more space because you need space to be able to get between your crops as they're growing. If you're planting in beds like I am, which, by the way, we can put this as a bonus space saving technique. Planting in beds rather than rows saves so much space. As you can see with my beds here, I have this whole bed. This is 4 feet wide. Over here, this is also 4 feet wide. And in between them, I just have a little walkway. As opposed to needing a walkway between each row of crops within this bed, basically it maximizes the amount of space that is used for food production and minimizes the amount of space that is used for walkways. So planting in beds like that does allow you to kind of play around with spacing a little bit and plant a little more closely than is often recommended. If you are going to plant very closely like that, you do want to make sure that you have a really rich, fertile soil that's going to be able to provide for all of the nutritional needs of your plants. So I recommend amending your soil with compost. Depending on the type of plant you're growing and the type of soil you're starting with, you may need additional soil amendments as well. So you can kind of play around with that. If you want to be scientific and know for sure, you can get a soil test, which will tell you exactly what your soil is lacking. But for the purposes of this video, just make sure that you give your plants really rich, fertile soil, and then you can play around with spacing them a little bit more closely than is often recommended. One factor that you may want to consider when you're deciding what to grow in your small garden is the amount of harvest you get from a single plant compared to the amount of space that it takes up. Now, obviously, there's some wiggle room here. Grow things that you love, grow things that you're really going to enjoy eating, but you don't necessarily want to, say, devote your entire garden space to, say, something like cauliflower, which I love cauliflower. I'm growing cauliflower in my garden, and I probably always will. But cauliflower does take up a fair amount of space, and it's a one-and-done harvest. Once you get your cauliflower ahead and harvest it, that plant is not going to provide more cauliflower for you. So you can then rip out the plant and replace it with something else. But cauliflower does take a fairly long time to mature, and then you just get the one harvest from it. I'm not saying don't grow cauliflower. As I said, I've got a bed back there with lots of cauliflower in it, and I'm growing it because I love it. But it's just something to consider. If you're trying to choose between a couple plants and you're really limited on space, you may want to choose something like tomatoes that are going to yield continuously for a long season, or maybe something like lettuce, which grows really quickly. It doesn't take up a lot of garden space, and then once it grows and you harvest it, you can replant with something else. So just take into account how much harvest you're going to get from each plant versus how much space it takes up. So one natural consequence of growing in a smaller space is that you're going to have room for fewer plants. That means that you're going to have to be limited. You're not going to be able to necessarily grow everything that you want to grow. And believe me, I understand how hard that is. I would grow so much more in this garden if I had the space. But if you're trying to decide what to grow, there's a couple things you might want to consider. One thing is to consider what's going to save you the most money at the grocery store. Now, there are some plants that, say zucchini, for example. Zucchini is beautiful and delicious. Zucchini does produce abundantly, but zucchini in the summer is often really affordable at the grocery store. Now, I'm not saying don't grow zucchini again. I grow zucchini too. It does take up a fair amount of space though, and it's not ultimately going to save you all that much money. You will get a better tasting zucchini, and you will know exactly how that zucchini is grown. So if you have the space for it, by all means, grow zucchini. But I'm just using it as an example of something that you may not necessarily choose that's not going to save you as much money as, say, if you grow cherry tomatoes or if you grow heirloom tomatoes, something like that. Those are significantly more expensive at the store, and the plant is going to yield quite a bit more for you, especially if you're growing rarer or harder to find varieties. That can save you a lot of money. One great bang for your buck is to grow culinary herbs. Now, herbs are crazy expensive at the grocery store. When I look at herbs at the grocery store, I am so thankful that I have herbs growing here. Sometimes in winter I need chives or something like that, and I don't have chives in my garden, and it's really painful to go spend, $3 or $4 at the grocery store on a tiny little pack of chives when I know I can grow basically unlimited chives in my garden for free most of the year. So Culinary herbs are really easy to grow for the most part. They're really delicious. They really will take your cooking and your eating to the next level. And they're very expensive at the grocery store, so that's a great place to start too. So I would just take a look at your grocery budget, see what you're spending a lot of money on, take a look at plants that you're thinking about growing and see what expected yield you can get from those plants to see where you can put the biggest dent in your grocery budget. Now, as anyone who is a gardener, has been gardening for a while, can tell you, gardening is not all about saving money. Honestly, you don't always save a lot of money gardening. You certainly can, depending on how you approach it. But there's a lot of other reasons to garden too. And one is that the food that you grow yourself is just so much better. You know, there's no comparison between a homegrown tomato that's delicious and sun-ripened and fresh compared to those little, kind of mealy, round things that you get at the store. There's no comparison. So a homegrown tomato is something where there is a huge difference in quality in homegrown versus store-bought. So that's another thing I would think about when choosing what to grow. If you're limited in space and you're limited in varieties, choose the things where it really makes a big difference to have them homegrown. Now that is going to be really subjective. Everyone has different tastes, everyone has different preferences. So you should always grow something that you love, something you're going to be excited about growing, and something that is going to be, it's really rewarding, for example, to grow tomatoes, just because they're so much better. Even if you go to the farmer's market, they're not going to be quite as fresh as if you grow them yourself. So farmer's market is a great option. But if you're able to grow tomatoes yourself, I definitely recommend it because that is the thing, probably to me, that is the biggest difference. One other thing that I encourage you to think about when choosing varieties to grow, when trying to narrow down what varieties you want to grow, is what can you not buy at the grocery store locally? Now, there are lots of things that are always available. Everyone has access to tomatoes, broccoli, but do you have access to striped yellow tomatoes? Do you have access to sprouting broccoli? There's so many different things that you may want to enjoy and experience that you can't buy locally at the grocery store. One of my favorite summer harvests is raspberries. I love raspberries. And I have the classic red raspberries, but I also have these beautiful coral blush raspberries that honestly I can't find at the grocery store anywhere. I think one of the reasons is because they do spoil fairly quickly, so shipping them, packaging them, letting them sit in the grocery store isn't really practical. But I get to experience those because I grow them myself, and they have an amazing flavor. So there's just so many things that you may not be able to ever eat or experience if you don't grow it yourself. So that's another thing. If you're trying to prioritize space, choose the things that you won't have the option to buy at the grocery store or even the farmer's market. So those are just a few of the ways that I like to save space in my small garden. If you have any other space saving techniques, if you're watching this video and you have a small garden, I would love to hear how you save space in your garden, especially if it's something that I didn't mention in this video, because I know a lot of people, as I said, are gardening in smaller spaces than I have. And honestly, if I get some good tips for space saving, I'm likely to put those into practice in my garden too. So I would definitely love to hear from you about that. As the season goes on, we'll be walking through this garden together. I'll be updating you on how everything grows. And we'll talk a little bit more about how these space-saving techniques work in my garden as the season goes on. I showed you my cattle panel trellises. Those are empty right now. But once the last frost date goes by, I'll be planting these with beans and cucumbers. In my garden expansion, I'm planning to grow small pumpkins and melons and all kinds of things on these cattle panel trellises. So I definitely hope that you'll come back and hang out with me again, and I can show you my garden updates as the season goes on. Thank you so much for spending a little time with me today. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.